Before 1066, justice was often random and brutal. The law was frequently used to instill fear and control the common people, and the most important figure in a court of law wasn't human at all. Back in medieval times, no man could decide whether another man was guilty or innocent. That was up to God, and the court, which often took place in a church, was the place where God's judgment was revealed. And the usual way of doing this was by what was called a trial by ordeal. At the beginning of the trial, the priest would call upon God to give his judgment, while the accused underwent an ordeal. For instance, the suspect might have to hold the hot end of a poker like this and walk 5 paces before letting go of it. Imagine the damage that that would have caused to your hand. So, what was the point of that? Well, if the hand healed quickly, then God had pronounced the man innocent. But if it took a long time to heal, or it blistered or festered, then God had said he was guilty. It was mostly petty criminals or innocent peasants who suffered this gruesome justice. Man-to-man combat was the Norman way for men to settle legal disputes. It was called trial by battle, and it now took its place alongside trial by ordeal as part of English law. If a man was accused of a serious crime, such as murder or rape, he could prove his innocence by fighting his accuser. Fights took place in front of a large crowd and had the atmosphere of a country fair.
Are you ready to rumble?
They'd last until one of the men surrendered or was killed. It was still divine justice, because God would ensure that the innocent would always prevail. But trial by battle had some obvious pitfalls. Because it relied on brute strength, it provided a legally sanctioned arena in which a big bloke could beat up a much smaller enemy. Local lad Jason Colley has been in trouble a few times for being drunk and disorderly, and earned himself an ASBO. He's keen on his history, so I'm going to show him how a young lawbreaker like him might have been treated 900 years ago. Right, Jason. When you were up in front of the court last time, what were you charged with?
Breach of ASBO.
It's a cycle of crime you're in, isn't it?
Never ends.
If you'd done something like that in the medieval period, then you would have been chucked into this place. This is genuinely Bridlington's medieval prison. In you go. And you would have been banged up in here. You ever been in one of these places before?
Yeah, a few times.
All right, you're going to feel quite at home then, aren't you? If he'd done something really horrendous, then he wouldn't just have been thrown into prison. William the Conqueror's favourite punishment was to castrate somebody and then to blind them, but we won't do that to you because it'd be a bit messy.
Thank you.
Have you had enough?
Yep.
You going to be a good boy now?
I am.
Well, that's not the end, because now the humiliation starts. We've got 200 extras, and they're going to jeer at you while we go all the way into the town square. Come on. Actually, I was lying about the extras.
Oh, good.
How far's the old marketplace?
About 5 minutes away.
Right, you would now be whipped all the way down to the marketplace with the crowds jeering at you. You have a go.
This will be fun.
Christ, that hurts. And finally, bruised and bleeding, we get to the market square. Can you lift that thing up for me? Do you know what this is?
Pillory turnip.
It is a pillory indeed, and this is quite horrible because you can't move once you're in this thing, and they might throw stones at you and excrement and all sorts of horrible stuff, and people could actually die in the pillory. Thanks a lot. But if you've done something like, sit down here please, mess up your ASBO, then you go in here, and the Actual punishment would depend on who you were. If you were a baker and you'd been selling stale bread, then they probably just lob the bread at you. If you'd been a greengrocer selling stinking vegetables, you get those. What a tragedy it is that the tomato wasn't introduced into England until several hundred years later. Public humiliation was a common punishment in Norman times. With the absence of a police force, it was about the best they could do to deter petty criminals. But even though the Normans now ruled the entire country, justice was haphazard. Punishment in particular was a postcode lottery. It all depended on where you lived. In Winchester, a convicted thief would be mutilated. In Dover, he'd be chucked off a cliff. In Sandwich, he'd be buried alive. In some seaport towns, he'd be tied to a stake below the high water mark and left to drown. In other words, justice was local rather than national. Community justice is controversial now, but in Norman times it was the standard way of dealing with petty criminals. It was never going to be enough, though, for an occupying army trying to suppress an entire population. Because they were unpopular, many Normans were being murdered by resistance fighters, and the killers were being concealed by local villagers. The Normans had to put an end to these killings and decided they'd use the law to do it. For the first time in England's history, its rulers were strong enough to enforce their justice on the entire country. So they created this law that said if any Norman was murdered and the culprit wasn't handed over, then the entire village would be subject to a crippling fine. It was named after the Latin for secret killing and was called the murderum fine. But it had rather unexpected consequences. Early court records recall the story of a corpse turning up in the village of Sutton near London. Imagine the scene. An unidentified body turns up and the entire village of Sutton flies into a panic because if it's a Norman, they'll have the murderum fine slapped on them. So what do? They pick up the body and they dump it in a nearby village so that they'll get the blame. But shortly afterwards, they get a taste of their own medicine, because in another nearby village, another body comes floating down the river. These villagers have exactly the same fears. They fish out the body and they dump it back in Sutton. What a farce! Normans being bumped off all over the place, bodies being shifted to and fro. Everyone's up to the same trick, trying to make sure that no unidentified bodies land on their turf. The murderum may not have been entirely foolproof, but it shows that a major shift was taking place in the evolution of the law from the local stocks to justice on a national level. Finally, in 1154, when William's great-grandson Henry II claimed the English throne, the country's fortunes began to change. A century after the Normans first arrived here, one of our most enlightened English kings turned the old Norman ideas on their head and began a revolution in English justice. What a bizarre lot judges are with their red robes and funny wigs. They're part of our quirky establishment. These days, they can sit in judgment on anyone who breaks the law. Prime ministers, Home Secretaries, even members of the royal family. Back in the 12th century, they had far less clout, and their rise to power happened almost by chance. When Henry II came to the throne, the country and its legal system were in tatters. He urgently needed to assert royal authority and rebuild respect for the law. And the means he chose to do that were much more sophisticated and less brutal than those of his Norman ancestors. He pulled together a team of senior judges and sent them all over the country. These travelling justices had got the power to overrule the local sheriffs and make sure that the king's law was implemented throughout the entire land. In fact, they were so successful that 800 years later, Henry's judges are still with us.